Our first reading is found in Lamentations 3, which is on page 1279 in your pew Bibles. Lamentations 3, beginning with verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. We are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. For men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. The ending of the first lesson. The second lesson can be found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and found on page 1802 in your pew Bibles, beginning with verse 7. Here we find that Paul has visited the church in Corinth, and he's talking about the church's generosity. But just as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in your love for us, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I am not commanding you, but I want to feel the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And here is my advice about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what he does not have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. Then there will be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little did not have too little. The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Abby. Our gospel reading this morning comes to us from Mark chapter 5. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came there, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live. So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And at once Jesus realized that the power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." And while Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead." And they said, "Why bother the teacher anymore?" And ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." And he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they'd come to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly, and he went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. And after he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with them and went in where the child was, and he took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the little girl stood up and walked around, and she was 12 years old. And at this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. And please be seated. If you've been paying any attention at all to what's been happening in the political theater, the political realm the past few years, let alone the past few years, for that matter, there's been a lot of harsh words and criticisms going back and forth. And now, I know it's been going on for a long time. However, this poor rhetoric does seem to be heightened even higher recently. There's this general animosity towards one another, this attitude of I'm right and you're wrong, and it's my way or the highway, and it's all been thrown back and forth, this mudslinging from one political party to another and vice versa. The polarity is so thick. And if you're like me, it's to the point where it's becoming so disgusting and so sickening, and it's really embarrassing. And we need more of an authentic and real and civil and open dialogue in our nation's political conversations, even between some of our neighbors who think differently than different perspectives than us here locally as well. We have this. It's seeped down to a local level, don't you think? And some would say that we even need more vulnerability. I mean, times are tough and a lot of people are hurting, and we need more open and honest dialogue about what is really going on, and we need to begin to see that we need one another because nobody has it all together. It's like we're afraid of letting others know that we might not have all the right answers, that we're afraid to lose power, that we forget that there's strength in vulnerability, and that we don't want to ask the other side for help. And it can be so frustrating for many of us who are not in that world to understand. At least for me, it makes me want to say, you think that you have it all together, that you have it all figured out, that you have to hide behind your belief that you always have to be right. Some of us have a hard time admitting that we're wrong as well, don't we? I'm there. That's me too. But I would venture to guess that even more of us have a hard time admitting that when times get tough, we don't have what it takes to keep it all together. When we have a hard time asking others for help. When life is difficult, am I right? We have spent so much time and effort and energy in our lives making it look like we have it all together, this facade, this mask that we wear, that we have a hard time admitting that we actually don't have things together. After all, the other option is often frightening and scary. We have a hard time admitting weaknesses because for some of us, we're afraid that someone might take advantage of us, or that if people found out that we aren't perfect or that we don't have it all together, that we would let them down somehow. Or if we admit that we don't have it all together, others would think less of us, that they wouldn't somehow love us anymore. And yet, for others of us, we hang on so tightly to our pride that it's hard to let go. So there's all this pressure from our culture and society to have things all in order and all things together. And it can be so exhausting to keep up that facade. Now I admit it, I'm not the greatest at letting those that I love, that there are times in my life when there is a whole world of hurt inside of me. It can be a frightening place to be, and there are times when I want to hang on so tight to that exterior image of put-togetherness. But I also realize that the alternative to that is also exhausting and draining as well, and that allowing God to bring healing to my own life sometimes requires me to be vulnerable. Come on now, can any of you relate to that? I know that for sure. We all deal with this. In our story today from the Gospel of Mark, Jesus engages the lives of three different people. Three different people in some significant ways. They are all faced with a great deal of hurt in one way, shape, or form or another in their lives, and which led them or forced them in some cases toward allowing a sense of vulnerability to take place, which ultimately led to healing in their lives. To begin with, Jesus has this crowd that is following him all around, and a religious leader named Jairus falls to his knees at Jesus' feet, asking Jesus to come to his house where his daughter is sick and dying so that he can come and heal her. This is an extreme display of desperation on part of this father. He's a leader in the synagogue, respected in his community, a competent, get things done, keep it all together kind of a guy. That is until his daughter gets really sick, and he's worried that she's not going to make it. I can imagine the desperation that Jairus is experiencing. He takes risks, the risk of being humiliated by falling at Jesus' feet, begging for Jesus to come to his house to bring healing to his daughter. His love for his daughter has left him thoroughly vulnerable. Jairus is desperate, but Jesus is willing. And the second person Jesus encounters is this woman, who's about as close to the opposite as Jairus in terms of prominency in the community. After all, she's not a leader like Jairus is, and she has no social standing in the community at all, and she's extremely sick, and she has had this problem of bleeding for 12 years, continuously for 12 years. And this condition would have regarded her as being impure, someone who had been rejected by society, and she's got to be feeling a great deal of isolation from her community and the world around her because no one wants to get close to her for 12 years. what complete exhaustion on a number of levels this woman must have been experiencing. And yet this woman braves the crowd with the thought of, if only I could touch his robe, maybe I would be healed. Jesus is willing and fully present. And then there's this young girl who is very sick, on the brink of dying, and at the time it took for Jesus to get to her house, she has passed away, we read. Or so it seems. They tell Jesus not even to bother with her anymore because she's already dead, but Jesus enters the room, takes the girl's hand, and tells her, "Little girl, get up." This girl had to rely on the faith of her father to bring Jesus to her bedside to bring her healing. There is so much happening in this story that we read that I would venture to say that most of us can probably identify with something that's going on or someone in this story. Think about that for a moment. Out of the three people who Jesus encountered in the story, who would you identify with the most? Is it the leader of the synagogue? Is it Jairus, who, even with all his status and his privilege that goes along with his position, he feels desperate? And in the end, none of his privileges do him any good in this situation. He feels like he can't do anything for his daughter. Or maybe you identify with a woman who has dealt with so much for so long that she's completely exhausted by life that she feels as if she cannot go on any longer. Or just maybe you identify with the 12-year-old girl who is dying, literally cannot do anything for herself. She's utterly reliant on other people to take care of her. So who do you identify with the most? It's tough to name it, isn't it? It's tough to put ourselves out there and name what is actually going on inside of our own lives that we can identify with in this story. And if you're one of those that it's easy for you to identify who you identify with, I would bet that it would be even tougher for you to share your feelings with others around you. Vulnerability is a hard thing. It's difficult to trust enough to open ourselves up to others, to our friends, and sometimes to even our very own families. And this is where being a part of our community of faith can become a place of such beauty and grace, where all of God's people are welcome to gather and share in life together. So what do we do about this? How can we gain the courage to be this kind of place? This place that can be so frightening and unsettling for inside of us if we're not used to sharing our feelings, yet this place that can also bring so much healing, not only from in our own lives, but in the life of the body of Christ and in our community of faith. Many of us already know that it's only in admitting our weaknesses that we are able to gain the courage to ask for and receive help. That there is strength in vulnerability. A professor of mine once said that perhaps admitting to our own need isn't the end of the world that we think it might be. But admitting to our own need is the end of the world that we've constructed, or the world that has been forced upon us. And as the world of self-constructed and culturally created perfection crumbles around us, we're invited to enter a new world of mutual regard, mutual acceptance, and interdependence. And that the only way to trust God's great "I love you" is to first hear God's equally important "I know you." The only way to trust God's great I love you is to first hear God's equally important I know you. Because as long as we think that we're fooling someone, sometimes it's ourselves or it's a loved one or a neighbor or a friend or even God, we can never really trust that they accept us for who we really are. An open and accepting community. Isn't this the community that God calls us into? A community and world where we accept each other for who we really are and where we put aside enough of our own pride that is deep inside of us to realize that we can, in fact, depend on each other. That we actually need one another. A community where we can tell others, hey, you don't have to have it all figured out. We're just a bunch of imperfect people trying to figure out life for ourselves, trying to live lives faithfully to the one we follow. This is a place where we all can say, I can be myself. I don't need to have it all together. A place where we recognize that we are all in need of healing and wholeness. At the end of today's story, Jairus' daughter is healed. Jesus tells her, little girl, get up. And the little girl's life is restored to her. Writer Frederick Buechner puts us in the place of this little girl as he writes, as Jesus speaks to us, taking our hand and telling us to rise up and live, he writes, you who believe, and you who sometimes believe and sometimes don't believe much of anything, and you who would give almost anything to believe if you only could, get up. He says, all of you, get up. You who believe, and you who sometimes believe and sometimes don't believe much of anything, and you who would give up almost anything to believe if only you could, get up. All of you, get up. My friends, may we come to the table today, this Holy Communion, this Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, this meal of the body of Christ where we receive knowing that we are all broken, yes, that we are all imperfect, yes, but we are also beloved people of God. And as Jesus reaches out to us and says to us in this meal, come and live. Amen. Go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.